Welcome to Salina Media Connections Connected program. I'm Greg Stevens, your host. Today we are visiting with a rancher and food processor, people's advocate, animal advocate from St. Francis, Kansas, and Evergreen, Colorado, Mike Callicrate. Welcome, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Greg.
Yeah, Mike's been a long-time cattle feeder in St. Francis, and why don't you tell us your story, Mike?
Well, Greg, I'm originally from Colorado, Evergreen, Colorado, and got interested in the cattle business really through my rodeo career and college. And I was on the rodeo team in Lamar, Colorado, where I got interested in animal science. And don't confuse that with animal husbandry. But I ran into a professor by the name of Red Heath at Lamar Community College, and I figured out what I wanted to do, and that's be in the cattle business. And so upon graduating from Colorado State University with an animal science degree, I went back to St. Francis, Kansas, and built my first feed yard in 1978 with a group of investors and local shareholders. Operated that for about 8 years, and then I went ahead and built my own place. That would have been around 1988. And that was just about the time I figured out that the meat packers really weren't competing for our cattle anymore. And was suspicious that there was some things going on that was really keeping us from getting a competitive market. And it was totally clear in my mind by 1990 when Bob Peterson admitted so much at the Kansas Livestock Association meeting that year. And so it's something I just wouldn't give up. I was in the cattle business. I was committed to the cattle business, and I really wanted to remain in it, but it just didn't seem like we could ever get ahead. I mean, I remember the 70s that were good years. There were bad years, but you made them up on the next turn. But boy, as you went into the 80s, it just got tougher and harder. And of course, you remember the farm crisis, which was devastating. But along with that, just a lot of losses on feeding cattle and just nothing you could do could really get you ahead. It didn't seem like. So anyway, by 1996, I had been speaking out, writing about it, and it attracted some attention from some lawyers out of Alabama, and they wanted to file a lawsuit against IBP, the leader, the real leader in the industry, who had developed captive supplies that allowed them to draw upon cattle that were outside of the competitive market, and thereby depressing the market. And of course, any of the cattle feeders that were still in the cash market were being hurt by that. And the guys that weren't in the cash market that were supplying captive supplies were getting a premium and had an advantage. And so by 1996, we'd filed this lawsuit. I'd agreed with the attorneys to be a plaintiff in that lawsuit, and we put together some other plaintiffs that in the end it did become a class action. But to be a class rep, you really had to have sold IBP cattle, finished cattle, which I had. And so it worked its way on through the courts. We finally ended up in the courtroom in 2004. First really private action based on the Packers and Stockyards Act since it was written in 1921. And it's important to know that the Packers and Stockyards Act is a law that is specifically directed at protecting the producer, not the typical antitrust law that was designed to protect the consumer. And so no one had enforced it. The Secretaries of Agriculture, whose responsibility it was, had avoided it and appeared by all presence that they were really in bed with the meat packer and facilitating the meat packer and ignoring the law and allowing them to continue to concentrate that market to a point where there simply was no competition. And so we ended up.
Mike, if I can interrupt you here, when you say there's no competition, what percent of the packers control, or how many packers control what percent of the market?
Well, in about 1970, the big four packers had probably 30-some% of the market, the big four. And that would have been IBP back then, Cargill, Montfort, and Cargill, Montford, IBP, National Beef would have been the fourth one. So, and then by the late 80s and 90s, they were up to 85% for firm concentration. And we've got a lot of university economists that would say that at 40% for firm concentration, you no longer have competition. And so we went well past that. And so basically I went from 1978, when I built that first feed yard in St. Francis, I had as many as 20 meat packers that I could sell my cattle to every week. And I just remember coming to work in the morning and one of the buyers might be sleeping in his car outside the gate so he could get the first look at our show list. It was very competitive. And a lot of the packers were from Colorado. We had Pepper Pack, Litvack, we had Alpha Beta out of Pueblo, we had Sterling Pack, we had Coleman that came along a little after that in Lyman. Just a really competitive market, and a lot of packers in Nebraska and more eastern part of Kansas, central to the eastern part of Kansas. And then we had our Oklahoma packers, our Texas Panhandle packers, and it was just a really thriving market. And so you were buying livestock, feeder cattle and calves in a competitive market, bidding against other cattle feeders and buyers in sale barns. And at the same time, you were selling your finished cattle in a competitive market as well. And so as the concentration consolidation continued, what we found out is the big meat packers were actually cooperating. Back in 1975, Hughes Bagley worked for IBP as a vice president and shared with me during the lawsuit, which he had a lawsuit against IBP on another matter, but we became friends because we were really both suing IBP. Hughes told me back in the middle 70s that they had a Boston consulting firm come in to the company and advise them on how they could do better. And he said one of the outcomes of that advice was that they said you should be cooperating with these other guys because they're big. And back then that would have been Cargill and Montford. Montford later became Conagra, later then became Swift, and now is JBS, the biggest packer in the world, a Brazilian company. And so looking back and finding that out really did make you feel like you were the fool in a fool's game, which we no doubt were. And so we won the lawsuit in the case in Montgomery, Alabama. The jury awarded us, cattle producers as a class, $1.28 billion. The judge very promptly reversed that jury verdict and took that jury award away from us. And it's not an award we really cared much about. I mean, 1.28 billion wasn't going to go very far, and they were taking that much away from us every month or so. But what we really wanted was the injunctive relief. We wanted the packers to have to give up their captive supply, re-enter the cash market, compete, and maybe even as injunctive relief, break them up so that we could get back to where we were in the late 70s and early 80s with lots of competition and lots of local and regional type facilities that were serving their communities. That didn't happen. The judge out, reversed it, and charged us $80,000 for Tyson's court cost. So we went from winning 1.28 billion to having to pay the court $80,000 as we left Montgomery, Alabama. We went ahead and appealed the case, and unfortunately, with all of the Reagan-appointed judges that didn't believe in antitrust law enforcement, our trial court judge, Lyle Strom, was one of those. They simply refused to let us win that case. So we took it to the Supreme Court. John Roberts, Chief Justice John Roberts, had just been seated as Chief Justice. We knew that was going to be hard because he was representing just prior to that the USDA in a checkoff case against the cattle producers. And as we thought would likely happen, the Supreme Court refused to hear the cattleman's case, which we felt was the most important case in 100 years as it related to the cattle industry. And instead of hearing the cattleman's case, they heard the Anna Nicole Smith family feud case, which honestly didn't have a lot of relevance and impact on society. So we basically, as a result of that Supreme Court decision to not hear our case, gave the green light to the big meat packers to plunder and pillage all they wanted without any recourse, without any law enforcement. And that was something that was really terrible. And when you look back in the 70s, we were as cattle producers, we invest the most money in capital. We work the hardest. We take the most risk. Yet we go from receiving 70% of the consumer beef dollar in 1970, 68 to 70%, down to now 35% of that consumer dollar. At the same time as the big meat packers are saying they've got economies of scale and they're efficient. And what I would argue is that they're a monopoly, and what they're really efficient at is extracting wealth from cattle producers and pig producers and poultry farmers and workers and the environment and the government in the way of subsidies. And today we've got Trump ordering the packers to continue to slaughter no matter what. So they really are in bed together with the government. USDA has been very difficult to work with. They won't enforce the Packers and Stockyards Act. They apply regulations on small processors that are onerous, unnecessary. They really, you can feel it that they want to see fewer small plants. They don't like small plants because from an inspector's perspective, they can utilize the inspector's hourly work a lot more efficiently on 6,000 cattle a day than they can on 10 or 20 cattle a day in a small plant.
How many small plants exist in Kansas now? Do you know the chance?
There's just a handful. There's a few custom plants that aren't USDA inspected, and then there's just a few USDA inspected plants. But all of us, and I'm one of them, it's just been a knockdown, drag out fight to survive. And so there's a few still hanging on, but you look at this COVID thing, and it would sure be nice if we had more local slaughter and more regionally produced food, that we didn't have to worry about this global supply chain breaking on us, which John Tyson admitted in the New York Times letter that he wrote over the weekend and other papers as well. He admitted that it's broken. In fact, I think John Tyson basically gave us the case to break him up, and we should break him up. We should rebuild our local regional food systems. And I think back, and I knew the Peppers in particular, Marvin Pepper and Freeman Pepper and Joe Pepper. I knew the Litbacks in Denver. These guys did really well. And back then the grocery stores made a good living on their meat counters, and cattle producers got 70% of what consumers spend for food. The system worked, and it can work again. We just have to have the political will to rebuild it.
So I want to go back to the comment you made just a little bit ago and explore that a little bit. Tyson Foods, Time Magazine, it was in New York Times, excuse me. The food supply chain is breaking. Why?
Well, what do you expect? I mean, the beef is in the hands of 4 multinational corporations. And 2 of those players of the big 4 are Brazilian companies. They're basically here to extract all the wealth they can and take it home. It's just like Smithfield in the pork business. Smithfield kills 1 out of every 4 hogs in America. They're extracting the wealth from our countryside, not only in water, soil, but in people, in labor, and they're taking those profits home. And they have absolutely no regard for the communities that they're located in, and obviously didn't have any regard for their workers as we saw the COVID thing come in. And so it has to break. It can't help but break. And that system is always running at as close to 100%, if not 110% of its capacity, because that's what shareholders and top executives demand. Where you take a smaller local regional plant like myself, we never run at those kind of levels because we are unwilling to abuse our workforce. We're unwilling to steal livestock to bring into our plant. We're unwilling to pollute the environment because we live here. We're unwilling to just disregard all of the normal things that a person with integrity wouldn't do. And so it can't help but break. And so many things can go wrong today.
So the
Thing that's
COVID virus,
slowly going. What's that, Greg?
I said the COVID virus is one of these things that's going wrong.
Oh, absolutely. But one of the
You
things
got
that we've done
workers
today,
shoulder to shoulder in the plants. And what was it? President Trump announced today that the plants can't close.
that's what he did. He announced that the plants can't close. And, the thing is, JBS shifted their cattle ownership over to another company. It's a Pinnacle investment firm out of New York to buy the feed yards and to own the cattle. Now, that came with a guarantee. That came with a sweetheart deal on the cattle that this group is feeding for JBS. But when I drove by those feedlots from Yuma, Colorado to Greeley just the other day, I have never seen so many cattle in those yards. It looked like they were way over capacity. But you just think about what happens if you shut Greeley down. Where are those cattle going to go? They're just going to get bigger and bigger. And of course, they got to get them dead. They got to get them slaughtered. Well, you've seen what happened in the hog business. Just yesterday, we saw the picture out of northwest Iowa of hogs, fat, finished hogs stacked up in a big pile dead. They're throwing those animals away. And when you're running at 100%, 110% of capacity all the time, any glitch at all is going to leave you with a seriously broken mess. And so when I look at the possibilities of more smaller plants that never run at those kind of capacities, I mean, we could double our shift here. We could go a double shift if USDA would work with us, but they won't. USDA will not even give us any extra hours for processing during the day without charging overtime, which small plants can't afford to pay. And so just one of the requests I made of Food Safety Inspection Service, Paul Kicker, who's now the new administrator, I said, Paul, look, we've got 3.7 times the business that we had a year ago. It's wearing us out. Our workers can't keep up. They're tired. Give us a couple extra hours to operate during the day. It would not cost USDA one penny, not one penny, because we're a further processing plant in Colorado Springs as opposed to the slaughter facility in St. Francis, Kansas. He said no. Why would he say no to that request? It didn't cost any money at all, and it would give our workers a bit of a break. We'd be so rushed during the day, so stressed during the day, maybe give us a little time to rest and just have a more relaxed pace during the day. Absolutely not going to do that. And when I responded why and gave him reasons why he should decide in favor of that request, I simply never got a response. And so USDA does not work with small plants in a way that will allow small plants to operate efficiently and operate in a relaxed manner. It's nothing but a confrontational relationship. And USDA won't tell you this, but they're underfunded and they don't have enough inspectors. And so a simple request that I made to Food Safety Inspection Service was, why don't we employ rural veterinarians? The local vets don't have as much work to do as they used to have when the herd was bigger, before the liquidation, before half the cattle producers went out of business and 98% of the pig producers are gone, along with 85 or 90% of the dairymen. Local veterinary clinics could use the business. Why not use these highly trained and skilled veterinarians to come in and inspect those local facilities that could very well be built if we had the support for them? The answer is no. There's a Talmadge-Aiken Act that was passed, I think, in the 60s that allowed for state inspection, veterinarians and state inspectors to operate under the USDA's rules and be able to apply that grant of inspection mark on those livestock. That's available in several states right now. They refuse to expand that, which would greatly help small plants across the country. And so it seems like the deck is totally stacked against small plants and against independent livestock producers of every kind in our country.
You're talking about small plants, Mike. Tell me about Ranch Foods Direct. This is a plant that you're affiliated with or that you started. And I was looking online and it looks like at one time, and maybe still, or maybe there are more, you had like 40 different outlets, schools, restaurants, wholesalers, different groups that are carrying your product.
So, so
How,
Greg,
how has the COVID impacted what you're doing?
well, Greg, it's actually increased our business because we have meat on our shelves where the big stores do not have meat on their shelves. Their supply chain broke and ours didn't. Our supply chain is 200 miles long. It extends from Colorado Springs, which is where our processing facility is, along with 2 retail stores, from here to St. Francis, Kansas. And 20 years ago in 2000, I decided, to fight with the big meat packers. I decided that not only do we need to litigate and we need to legislate better rules that allow for local regional food system development and better prices to our livestock producers, but why don't we build the alternative pathway? And so that's what we did in 2000. We slaughtered our first cattle in June of 2000 at a Colorado Springs slaughterhouse called GNC Packing Company. And so we started selling meat instead of livestock. And that's what I've been doing for 20 years out of our facility in St. Francis. We slaughter there and we ship the carcasses rather than the live animal. We ship the carcasses into Colorado Springs where they are distributed. And, we used to have 5 school districts 7 years ago, 5 to 7 years ago. And it was a wonderful business. We were supplying healthy beef to all these students across Colorado. And then the big packers came in and decided they were going to undercut us. They basically said, look, we've got the same thing as Callicrate, except it's cheaper. They raised the price of milk at Meadow Gold, which was Dean Foods at the time, 9 cents a serving. And that really tipped these schools over and decided, well, we got to save that 9 cents. Let's kick out Callicrate and Ranch Foods Direct. So we lost all those schools. We had institutional accounts that were big. We had one in particular that bought $600,000 worth of meat from us every year. That's gone for a lot of the same reasons. We won't pay kickbacks to Cisco. We won't pay kickbacks to the big food management companies. Don't have the money. It's not right anyway, and you shouldn't be doing it. But the big packers do that all the time. And so the other big account we had was Chipotle. We supplied 23 Chipotles and we're in talks with them to go to 56 Chipotles, which would have included a lot more Denver locations. And that was a business we'd been real happy with for a while. And we had invested heavily in our plant to be able to supply that to Chipotle. And they called me up on a Friday evening about 5 o'clock one week. Rather than go to more Chipotles, you're not going to have any. And we were replaced with imported beef from Australia. So everything that we had 5 to 7 years ago when our company was really at its peak is all gone today because of a lack of antitrust law enforcement and because of a lack of enforcing food fraud. So we've got companies like JBS out of Greeley that has a brand called Aspen Ridge, and they claim that's this wonderful Colorado brand. Well, it's just JBS. It's JBS out of Greeley. And so basically they can put any label they want on anything they've got and make it look like Callicrate, make it look like Lassiter grassland beef, make it look like White Oak Pastures or Gunthorpe pork, anything they want to do, and there's simply no law enforcement. We haven't had any antitrust law enforcement since Reagan was president, and we haven't had any truth in labeling since Reagan was president either through the FTC. And so when I decided to build the alternative food system, I started thinking about how can I produce something better than what I was doing before in the industrial model. First thing you do is you get rid of the performance enhancing drugs. Second thing, Angus cow bred to a Wagyu bull, which is where Kobe beef comes from. So sell nothing but high quality. What if we could slaughter an animal where it is and not put it on a truck and stress it? That impacts meat quality. What if you could ship the carcass instead of the live animal? That reduces 37% of the weight that would otherwise be trucked to a slaughterhouse. How much water are we going to use in that slaughterhouse? How about 32 gallons per animal slaughtered versus the big packer at 740 gallons? That's why they're in high water areas like Garden City, Kansas, above the Ogallala Aquifer, in Fort Morgan, Colorado, along the South Platte, in places with water where they can extract, the big meat companies can extract the wealth of the area and the resources of the area. And so big packers talk about efficiency. I can give them a lesson in efficiency. Those guys think they have to box the beef. Well, why would you do that if you're going to cut it up into retail cuts? Why wouldn't you just ship the carcasses into Colorado Springs and cut it right directly into retail and avoid the whole box in the middle? Well, they did the box to put the small packers out of business and to make it easier on the retailers so that they could have retail ready cuts and could get rid of their higher priced butchers. But what else came with those boxes of beef? E. coli did. Because now what we've got is the bacteria on the outside of the carcass that without dry aging to eliminate that bacteria, they're safely packed in a bag that gets sold off as boxed beef. So we are better. The local regional food system model is absolutely better in every single regard. And the other thing is, when you buy a hamburger from Range Foods Direct, there may be a handful of animals in that hamburger patty, maybe only one. If you're buying our cow pool, which is an eighth or a quarter or a half or a whole animal, we don't use pink slime in our grind. We don't add 12% solution to our steaks that are selling in the store. We don't use carbon monoxide to make the meat red. We just have real food that's healthy and makes people feel good and makes them healthier. And so nothing the industrial model is doing is good. I can't think of a single thing that the industrial model is doing that is efficient, that is good for anyone. Not good. It's not good for the environment. It's not good for the depleted Ogallala aquifer that Tyson is drawing out of, and Cargill and JBS are drawing out of every single day without paying a penny for the water.
How is the industrial model going to be impacted, do you think, in the future, given the COVID-19 issue?
I think it goes away, Greg. I think the industrial model has got so many flaws, and the fact that it breaks and it's going to leave people hungry, it's going to leave livestock producers out of business. And you think about losing that many independent ranchers. I mean, where's our beef going to come from? We're going to just keep importing it? You know, what about the wealth that's created with those animals that are produced on these ranches? And I just really believe that consumers, through this experience, are going to find out that it makes more sense to buy local. And of course, they've got to get over this aggressive price shopping consumerism disease, which I think is a deadly disease in itself. And we've got to start realizing what is the real cost of the food that's on our plate. The industrial model, much of it is externalized, from the low wages they pay their workers to the subsidies that we as taxpayers have to fund in order to pay farmers to grow corn below cost of production, the Roundup that pollutes our soils, the soil loss. The biggest export out of Iowa is their topsoil. I mean, none of this is working long term. And so I really think it's time to take a good hard look at some alternatives and get the government policy to support what is good for consumers and taxpayers, rural communities, and all the people who do the work and produce our food.
Washington Post had a headline, experts warn that U.S. could be weeks away from severe meat shortages. You believe that?
Absolutely. I mean, as we've got these big plants shut down, I mean, these livestock are backing up. They're slaughtering hogs and piling them up in piles in Iowa. No word of any cattle because, you know, we can just make the cattle bigger. I mean, actually, the packer doesn't mind if they weigh 1,500 pounds. They just have more meat in the truck at the end of the day. But there could be some serious shortages at some point, especially if we get another wave of this COVID. Because President Trump cannot force workers to go to work in slaughterhouses where they may come home sick and infect their community. He can't make them do that. He may say to go to work, but you cannot sentence a man to death for wages. And this is exactly what could very well happen. So we do have to be cognizant of that industrial model, the fact that these are refugee workers. These are not people that are paid living wages that we're asking to go to the front line and risk their health and their life for us to eat meat. So I think it fails. I think long-term it fails. I think right now we have to accept that, and all these trillions of dollars that we're throwing out there to bail this economy out, let's invest it in plants, in a food infrastructure that really does serve the people.
That would be more of a local infrastructure slaughterhouses, custom butchers. Is it possible to bring those back?
Yes, all you have to do is support them. There's a lot of people would love to build one and run one. In fact, give you an example, in Mullen, Nebraska, there's a plant that's been up there for years, and Jacob Wingbach came in and bought the plant with his family, and he is requesting a grant of inspection from USDA. So far, they've refused to give him one. There's no real reason. He's a nice little plant with good skills and the ability to run the plant. But the USDA just doesn't want to supply an inspector to that area because honestly, they don't have them, and they really don't want another small plant in operation. And so we've got to shake up the USDA. We really do need to get rid of these career people that work for the big meat packers. But that plant in Mullen needs to be operating. They need to be killing 20 or 30 animals a day and feeding into the system. But prior owners of that Mullen plant couldn't get market access. Well, I knew the prior owner. He was just trying to sell ground beef into the school system. He couldn't even get that business with cull cows. And so we've got to take care of what the predatory nature of this marketplace has got to be fixed. You cannot allow these big meat packers to go around with their Brazilian, South American, Australian beef, African beef this week, and pricing it to wholesale and into the institutional and retail markets so far below our cost of production. This has all got to stop. And so I remember years ago when I got blackballed in my feedlot and I couldn't sell my cattle. I had 14,000 head in a 12,000 head feedlot. I called up Dan Glickman, Secretary of Agriculture, who you know well as a rep from Kansas. And I said, Dan, if you'd enforce that Packers and Stockyards Act, I wouldn't have this problem. And he said, well, Mike, in this modern age of globalization, it takes big companies to do business globally. Wow. And this has been ingrained in this agency and in our government now for many, many years. And we have got to fix that. We have to get that viewpoint extracted like a cancer out of this agency, out of the USDA. We need new people that care about healthy, safe, and wholesome food, and food that is produced in our local regional areas with a fair reward back to the farm and ranch gate and to the workers who process it to our plates.
We've been talking about pork, beef, same thing's happening in dairy, isn't it? Aren't they dumping milk, I hear on the news, upper New York, what have you. At the same time, there's been milk off the shelves that have disappeared, kind of shortages.
Greg, I mentioned earlier in our
Food banks
discussion,
all these long lines. What's it going to take to bring some of this production to the other side of the spectrum here, like food banks and what have you?
Well, Greg, I mentioned earlier that I had that school lunch business here in Colorado, and it was Medigold who came in and raised the price of milk 9 cents a serving after they had agreed with Sinton's Dairy here in Colorado Springs, a longtime local dairy here in our area, to stop making school lunch milk. And Sinton had just been purchased by Grupo Lala, really the equivalent of Dean, or sort of the dairy monopoly of Mexico. And so Grupo Lala, I understand it, got with Dean, and they agreed in Colorado Springs not to make school lunch milk anymore. And Medigold would take that over. Well, as soon as that happened, they raised the price 9 cents, which drove me out and didn't allow anyone else into the milk market. And isn't it interesting that Medigold is one of Dean's divisions filed bankruptcy? Dean Foods filed bankruptcy, our biggest dairy company in the country. And these are the companies that are predatory pricing. These are the companies that are forcing the smaller dairies out of business. And obviously they weren't making enough money, and they weren't as big and powerful as Walmart, and they ended up going broke. And so that whole system caved in and crumbled. And of course, DFA, Dairy Farmers America, want to come in and try to buy Dean. And honestly, what money do they have? And they're all dealing with Walmart, who's the real problem here. The really big problem is the retailer, having abusive power over those who process for them. But I think what it's going to take is it's going to take government intervention. I think the government has to do today what happened in 1921. 1920, we had a consent decree that basically broke up the big meat packers and their abusive power. We have to do that today. The government has to step in and break up these companies. And we cannot let a foreign country like Brazil and the criminal Batista family control the beef industry in our country, as well as they're our biggest poultry processor. We cannot allow that ownership to continue. We cannot allow China to own Smithfield and control so much of our pork slaughter in this country. We cannot allow China to go in and make Iowa cave so that they can build more barns and pollute more water resources in the state of Iowa and see more topsoil leave the state. We have got to take our food system back. It's a national security issue. It's a food security issue. And I know it's really hard to say you have to break up Walmart, but we absolutely have to do that because Walmart has so much power. Walmart family members have more wealth than 40% of Americans. That is nothing is more threatening to a democracy than concentrated power and wealth.
That's probably a note in which we should leave this. I wanted to share one more item that I gleaned from the news, get your reaction to it. The Belgians raise a lot of potatoes, and the same thing's happening in the potato industry. And so they come out with a decree asking everybody to eat French fries twice a week.
Right.
So,
right. Well, Greg, when you take the hotel, institutional, and restaurant trade out of the equation, which we did with COVID, you've got more people eating at home, and they're not going to eat as many French fries. They're not going to eat out as much, and so a lot of the things that the economy was supporting, I don't think going forward will to that extent anymore. And so I'm glad you brought that up because you asked, well, what's going to happen, post COVID? And I'm saying restaurants aren't going to be as popular. I think people are going to eat more at home, and that could continue for some time. And what might be pretty amazing is how much better they feel and what better health they're in by preparing their own meals in their homes with real food. And so we really aren't going to need these industrial potato farms that produce, train loads and truckload after truckload of potatoes. And so all these people that thought their future was in specialization are going to find out that their future is really more in diversification. Putting livestock back on our farms, having good, healthy grazing programs. Everything that I do in St. Francis, Kansas with our farm and our ranch, everything we do goes through our livestock. And of course we diversified, so we raise pigs now. We also have chickens for eggs, but nothing goes off of our farm anymore to a multinational corporation. And we don't buy anything from a multinational corporation. So all I have to worry about then is making my customer happy in Colorado Springs.
And on that note, I think we'll end. I appreciate the words of wisdom that you have, Mike, and your long-time willingness to be a voice for a sector that hasn't had a voice for some time. And appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to visit with us here at Salina Media Connection. So thank you on behalf of all the viewers, and good luck in your future.
Thanks for the opportunity, Greg.
You bet.